So I have a standing policy in talks that I never start with introducing myself, because what you're inherently saying is that this is the most interesting high-level thing, is who I am and what I've done, and partially that's why I'm justified to be here. But this talk, it's a little bit necessary. For background, for those who, despite what Steve said, don't know who I am, which I'm told somehow is not a requirement to attend this conference, I run a small consultancy where we fix the AWS bill. It's the one thing that we do. Where people know me from a bit more is that I have a somewhat snarky personality online. I write a newsletter that makes fun of Amazon for a living because I have no self-preservation instinct, and I'm extraordinarily active on Twitter due to an escalatingly poor series of life choices. Now, the world generally believes that all of these things are triumphs and great successes of my life, and from a certain point of view, they absolutely are, but they're also rooted in failure. Because life is what happens to you instead of what you plan. This talk is called The Art of Personal Failure, and I've been kicking around the idea for over 5 years now. It doesn't fit in most conferences, because most conference talks, in case you've missed this, have been about successes. It's, here's how we did something and it was awesome. Like, you never see a talk, Pooches We Have Screwed, a technical guide. It doesn't work that way. So specifically, I'm going to talk about failure today. 3 stories of personal failure from my life. No more, no less. Some may resonate, some may not. But I've been meaning to give this talk for years. And the time is now, and the place is here. And I want to start by saying how much I hate this place. Not this room. This is a great venue, don't get me wrong. But this place. And that's kind of a bold statement. I mean, who winds up going somewhere and talking to the organizer, Steve, thanks for inviting us here, your state's a shithole. No one says that. And to be fair, there's nothing wrong, objectively, with Maine. It's me. I grew up less than 7 miles from here. This is coming back to face a lot of things that I didn't think about, and I try not to think about. And it's here that the failure stories begin. The first, and this might astound you for folks who haven't really put it together yet, I didn't get on super well with the Scarborough public school system. My parents always told me that I was a difficult child to raise, and I smiled and nodded and had no idea what they meant by that, and now I have 2 kids of my own. I get it now. So I wound up repeating my sophomore year of high school at a boarding school that I was shipped off to, and at the end of the year, they're like, wow, this is a really expensive school, and we sure like money. You know what we like more? You not coming back. I was expelled. And I went to a different boarding school for my junior year. Great. I am nothing if not efficient, and I optimized. I got expelled from that one just after winter break, because let's reduce the cycle time. That's what we all talk about. Shift left. Why not? So what happened then is I took a homeschooling program's test and got a diploma. So suddenly, there I am, having to figure out what's next for my life 1.5 years earlier than I expected to. Like, where do you go at the last minute, as I saw myself then, a complete academic fuck-up? In case any of you went there, that spells the University of Maine. And it's a fine school, but again, this is all from my weird perspectives, because I'm kidding, but I'm actually not, because when you grow up the way that I was raised, viewing state schools as something that, that's not where the people with potential go. And it was a reinforcing story of, oh, I'm smart, I'm going to go somewhere prestigious and study with the best minds of my generation. Apparently that would have been a mistake. They were all at Stanford studying how to make people click on more ads. That's what our generation has become, but okay, great. So was going to the University of Maine a failure? I don't think so. But a couple of years later, failing out academically, yes, that was a failure by definition. It's right in the phrase. And there are all different kinds of failures out there, but I believe the ones that hurt the most, the ones that really stick with you, are the ones that cut against your own self-image. If I strike out at baseball, for example, I don't care in the slightest because look at me. Somehow I am even less athletic than I look. The expectations for me on any sort of sporting endeavor are on the floor. The bar cannot go any lower without drilling. But getting kicked out of school, well, that would mean that I'm dumb. And for my entire childhood that I spent locked away, reading books and having no friends, I believed that I was smart and just a little misunderstood. I still have no degree, to be very clear. This is not a redemption story that I'm telling you. But today, that's a hell of a lot more acceptable in a lot of places than it was when I grew up, and this happened 20 years ago. And even if it's for the worst reason, and that is simply put that school is no longer affordable to an increasingly large swath of the population. And that's terrible, but it's also on some level, there's a silver lining to it, and that it's good, because it's making people reconcile throughout the entire space that there are multiple paths to what we define as success. And a degree is not required for all of them. I mean, some of them, yes. If you want to go be a dog surgeon, you're probably going to have to go to school and get a degree or two. But it turns out that there's no academic credentialing requirement for shit posting on the internet. I'm living proof of that. But it's kind of worse than that in my own personal story here, because remember that homeschooling organization? I found out years later they weren't actually accredited, and once I looked up what that word meant, it was, What that means is that toward the end of my 20s, I had to deal with the sobering realization that on paper, I only have an 8th grade education. But on balance, I mean, they can't take it away from me, so there is that. And the problem is that from where I viewed the world and the place that I stood, it really felt like it said something about me, and that something was not hugely flattering. I mean, today it's funny. I can tell that story with a bit of a wink and a nod and, use me as a cautionary tale. But when I was younger, it wasn't at all funny. It was devastating. Because the problem I had that I encountered was that a lot of those biases that I had, that smart people get degrees from good schools, they weren't just my biases, they were widely held by hiring managers. I want to detour for a second here. Now, I want to point out further that ADHD, tangent, you can work those into your slide deck if you work out hard enough. But I want to detour here because this is important. Biases that we carry can serve a purpose. I don't think it's unreasonable, for example, to have a bias that someone with an 8th grade education might have some challenges in a job where a bachelor's degree is the stated norm. And I got through that because of other biases that counted in my favor. I was respectful. I was a real go-getter. A lot of times the hiring managers saw themselves in me. I was professional. I knew how to dress myself. And they just had a good feeling about me. All of that really distills down to the same thing, which means that I am painfully white dude. I mean, look at me. Ketchup is too spicy for me half the time. And once upon a time, I non-ironically shopped at LL Bean. If you're wearing LL Bean gear right now, stop and think about what that joke might be saying. But again, further digression. I didn't recognize that implicit bias back then. I sure as shit do now. And if you don't, maybe pay a little bit better attention. Which brings us to my second failure story. I did tell you there would be 3. That's right. Tell them what you're going to tell them. So academia was clearly not for me, which meant that, all right, it's time to go and get a job. So packing that bias that I just mentioned into the situation I found myself in, it was hard to get a job, but it certainly wasn't impossible. My default approach was simply not to mention my lack of degree or just put my major and time on the school on without ever explicitly stating or not that I was no longer enrolled. And sometimes it worked, and other times it kind of fell through. And someone said this to me during an interview at one point. It's, no, but I hear that you have an excellent job training program here. In fairness, they prided themselves on this as a company, and somehow it worked, and I was able to land a role there. And leaning into their corporate vanity, let's be clear, just after they finished talking about how great their training program was, wasn't the worst direction when you're trying to persuade someone to take a chance on you. I've always been pretty good at handling job interviews, which is good, because I've had to have a lot of them over the course of my life. Because it turns out, with the benefit of hindsight, I wasn't a great employee. I know. I'm as surprised as you. I had a giant chip on my shoulder and I had something to prove. And I can empirically state that employers don't like that. I mean, it plays well on Twitter, for example, to say the snarky thing that people would want to say but don't actually say, and you just go ahead and say it. It's funny on Twitter. In an office environment, it doesn't work because when you point out the hypocrisy in the thing your boss just said, like, what do you think is going to happen past me? I've proven your argument logically inconsistent. That means I'm the manager now. Yeah, it turns out it doesn't. It was an experience. And until I ran my own business, I didn't really understand the subtext behind a lot of what was going on interpersonally in the workplace. Sort of strangely, now that I have, I get it now. And if for some reason I re-entered the workforce, I do think I would have a much better time of it now that I start to understand what, people who aren't me are thinking about these things. It's too late for me to fix things from early adulthood. So I got fired a lot. Any idea, pop quiz here, what it means when you're invited to a surprise last-minute meeting with your boss and someone from HR, and this part is key, they don't offer you coffee. Yeah. It means you're about to have a very bad day, and I mean that sincerely. There have been academic studies, numerously, that have demonstrated that for many folks, losing a job is one of the top 5 most stressful things that can happen to us as human beings. Some people routinely rate it as more devastating than a death in the family. And it happens for one of 3 reasons. The first is that the company has layoffs or goes out of business, and this sucks. You've lost your job. But most people, ideally, aren't going to have a significant sense of personal failure tied to it. You aren't personally responsible for Blockbuster going under, for example, I hope. Unless you work at Netflix, in which case maybe you kind of were. Our startup has reached the end of its incredible journey, is often how that winds up getting framed. Too bad, so sad, life goes on, and that's never happened to me. The next reason that you might get fired is because you really need to be fired. You've acted dangerously or unethically. You've embezzled money, committed fraud, punched a coworker. Something that you have done has made it actively impossible to retain you as an employee. And in this scenario, the odds are terrific that, getting fired is probably a good thing, at least for everyone else. If this happens to you, it's not the end. There's always a redemption arc if you need one, but really stop and think about exactly what happened and what changes you need to make in your life. I'm not here to make people feel terrible about themselves, but try and strive to at least not be quite as actively dangerous to your employer. This one also, for the clarity, has never happened to me. Which brings us to the third one, which means you're a bad fit. And this is far and away the most common reason that I see people let go. It means that you are potentially expensive to manage. It means that someone didn't like you in the right place. And this happened to me a lot. And when you get fired, let alone demonstrate a pattern of getting fired, people judge you. Part of what feeds this cycle, from where I sit, is a lack of empathy. Imagine a scenario where someone confides in you that they got fired. And some people, and I've been one of them, I admit this, have an immediate biased reaction, and you can see it in the way that they look at you. Let's say the quiet subtext part out loud for a second. Or at least that's how it feels. So much of it's projection. So when someone tells you that they got fired, there's a lot that you can say, but having seen people get it wrong, one thing I don't suggest you say is, well, you must have been a terrible employee. It's also important to remember the audience. In places with decent labor protections like Europe, someone getting fired, it's very hard to have that happen. Here it can happen because someone has a bad day and doesn't like you, but your job is protected in lots of other places. There's a cultural boundary there. When you start saying, oh yeah, I got fired, it sounds like you were stealing from the business as the default assumption. It's common there, and it's very difficult to get fired there when it is not for actual misconduct by and large. It's a process. The problem here is when this happens, once again, it erodes your entire sense of self-worth. We spend more waking hours at work, generally speaking, than we do with our own families. And there are an awful lot of problems with that, but one of them is that we tend to define ourselves by our jobs. Our work becomes our identity. So when we get ejected from a company and you don't do that thing anymore, it's like you're losing a part of yourself. And one of the reasons I founded a consultancy, if I'm being honest here, which is what I'm here to do, is not because I had this flash of blinding insight that was going to revolutionize the entire industry. It's because I got fired from my last job at BlackRock. And every other job that I saw looked like the different versions on the exact same thing. Another year at most, working in the same place, wondering every day as I watch my boss walk in, is today the day that it happens? I couldn't stomach it, so I did what I thought was the only option and built something from which I could not get fired. Can I make it sound like this noble aspirational story? Yeah, sure, of course. But it's not to me, not at night when I'm sitting there staring at the ceiling, wondering what sleep would be like and worrying about mistakes I've made in the past or yesteryear. I want to sidebar here as well before we move on, just because there's no manual on what to do when you find yourself in this situation. And I've made a bunch of mistakes doing it. So just a very quick survival guide for all of you. Hopefully you never need it, but it's good to know. If you're ever in this position, the first thing to do is stop. Breathe. You're not going to be able to change anyone's mind in that meeting. Sign nothing on the site. Leave politely. Don't literally do a table flip or whatnot. Go get lunch or dinner with a friend. Vent. Don't touch social media or your resume for at least a day. Tomorrow is still going to be there. And because of the society we live in, we've got to find other ways to make money. Which brings me to my third and final story of personal failure. Maybe, there we are. So we have a debt problem in our society, in case you've been oblivious here. In the US, medical debt can ruin you. I've mentioned previously in this talk that college is now unaffordable for an awful lot of us. The deck is stacked against people. But at least those two examples are relatable and understandable stories. I've been very fortunate medically, and I didn't have to take out loans in order to fail out of college. So on some level, it felt like I missed out on a generational experience there. So instead, I ran up $80,000 in credit card debt early on in my career. And that was roughly my annual salary around that time. And you want to talk about things people don't talk about, that's this. Because it wasn't buying a super nice car I couldn't afford in a moment of whimsy. It wasn't, well, I started a business on a credit card and things didn't pan out. It was simply, I was terrible with money. And being bad with money is interesting, and debt is interesting based upon who you are and what you do. When the wealthy or governments do it, it's called deficit spending, and it's a valid strategy for a whole bunch of things. Whereas when a 24-year-old does it, it's called being a fucking clown. Or at least that's how you feel in those moments. I sure did. And debt compounds and gets worse and worse, and you make worse choices because you're constrained into them. Your credit is tanked, so it's harder to get a decent car to take you to your job. So what do? You go out and you're driving an unreliable 1992 Chrysler shitbox, an underappreciated classic, sure, that you had to finance, no joke, at 28% interest. And the hole gets deeper, and when it's that deep, why stop? Go out and put dinner on the credit card because in for a penny, in for a pound. Why not? And it gets worse and worse and worse until you either find your way out of it or you die. And if you're lucky enough to get out of it, as I was, it forever changes your relationship with money and how you view it. You might guess around this point that my usual answer for the origin story of, hey, Corey, why do you work on AWS bills, might be something of a polite fiction. Because caring that much about weird billing and money things is not something a healthy, responsive person generally does. Trauma shapes you. It changes you in a bunch of different ways, and there's no one as passionate about things than a zealot. So failing out of school, getting fired a lot, and being deep in debt are my three stories of personal failures. Why did I pick these? It's not like I didn't have more that I could have gone for. Why am I giving this talk at all? Because, well, Steve doesn't vet things very well, apparently. But other than that, yeah. It's because over the course of my life, as I got older and I got close to people, and I told them one or more of these stories, a funny thing happened. And because the reaction was almost always universal. The "you're a piece of shit" response did not manifest. Instead, what happened is almost everyone I talk to tells me how at least one of these three things happened to them. And nobody ever talks about it. So when it happens to you, you feel like you're the failure, that no one else has ever been the place that you're in. No one else has ever screwed up this bad because you don't see it on social media. What you're doing fundamentally is comparing your own blooper reel to everyone else's highlight reel. And yeah, no one comes out of that looking good. So I came here to a place that I have desperately tried to bury in my own memory here, to tell stories that honestly are still highly sensitive to me, that eat at me in the darker hours when I'm waiting for something else to do. So I could plant a flag, which I didn't realize was going to be a flag of surrender, but here we are, and be extremely and intensively public about this. Because these things happen to most of us sooner or later, and they're lonely and isolating when they do. And nobody talks about them publicly other than as part of a redemption arc. And this is how it shaped the amazing thing that I wound up building. No, I found a way to work with it. But it's not the hero's journey story that people are expecting on these things. It's not what I came here to say. I'm not what I am because my trials made me stronger or some bullshit like that. I am what I am, to be very honest, is because I am deeply and profoundly damaged, and I'm doing the best with what I've got. And I am lucky beyond belief that I found a path that I could walk down where these things weren't deal breakers, because for a lot of situations, they absolutely are. Life is what happens to you instead of what you plan. I'm Corey Quinn, and I guess I embody personal failure. Enjoy Maine. Thanks.